In late summer 1941, the German Type VIIc submarine, known as U-201, sailed through the dark, cold waters of the Atlantic. On the night of August 17th, the crew prepared for a mission that would test their skill and courage. Far from the safety of any coastline, the vessel lay motionless on the surface. The commander and duty officers scanned the horizon through binoculars, searching for the faint outlines of enemy ships. They were hunting a large group of merchant ships, traveling from Great Britain toward the Mediterranean. This group was protected by armed escort ships designed to find and destroy submarines using underwater sonar. For those inside the cramped metal hull of the U-201, the situation was incredibly tense. A misstep or a loud noise could alert the escort ships to their presence. If detected, the pursuers would quickly become prey. The mission was simple yet perilous: break through the defenses and strike at the heart of the supply line. As the moon disappeared behind the clouds, the U-201 submarine began its advance toward the flickering lights on the horizon. The crew waited in silence, knowing that the next few hours would test their training to its limits. The success of the attack depended on timing, secrecy, and the decision of a single man. This mission would be easier to understand once we grasped the world this vessel had entered. To see how U-201 became a threat, we must look back at its construction and the technology that powered it. To understand how the U-201 submarine worked, we must look back to the shipyards in Kiel, Germany. The vessel was built during a time when naval warfare was escalating month by month. It entered service in January 1941, just as the battle for control of Atlantic supply routes was intensifying. The submarine belonged to the group of submarines known as Type VIIc, the most common type used by the German Navy throughout the war. It was designed to be a reliable workhorse, capable of venturing far into the Atlantic to search for targets. Physically, the vessel was a long, narrow steel tube, approximately 220 feet, about 6.7 meters long. Inside, space was incredibly cramped. Every inch was crammed with pipes, valves, and heavy machinery. There was little room for the crew of over 40 to move around. They lived in a world of constant noise and the smell of machinery. There was no privacy, and the soldiers had to share small beds in shifts. Because there was no room for supplies, food was often stored in every nook and cranny, including the bathroom. The U-201 submarine's power system was divided into two parts. When surfaced, the submarine used two large diesel engines. These engines allowed the submarine to travel at approximately 20 miles per hour. These diesel engines not only propelled the submarine, they also powered large generators to charge massive battery packs. When the submarine had to submerge for cover, it would switch off the diesel engines and use the electric motors powered by those battery packs. Underwater, the submarine moved much slower, only about 9 miles per hour. This meant the submarine spent most of its time on the surface, only submerging when necessary to attack or hide from enemy escorts. In terms of weaponry, the U-201 was built to be a silent killer. It had 5 torpedo tubes. 4 of these tubes are located at the front and 1 at the rear. The submarine typically carries a total of 14 torpedoes. On deck, there is also a large gun used to attack merchant ships when the submarine is surfaced and no enemy warships are nearby. One of its most important features is its deep-diving capability. The thick steel hull can withstand the immense pressure of the deep ocean. This allows the submarine to dive to depths of several hundred feet below the surface. The combination of speed on the surface and the ability to disappear into the deep seabed makes the U-201 a dangerous weapon of war. The design of the submarine is only half the story. Next, we will meet the commander who must operate it. Adalbert Schnee was chosen to command the submarine U-201. Born in 1913, he joined the German Navy in 1934. Like many young officers of his time, he was trained in the rigorous traditions of seafaring. Before commanding U-201, he spent years learning to navigate the complex world of underwater warfare. He had previously commanded two smaller submarines, where he demonstrated the composure and quick thinking necessary to survive in combat. Among his colleagues, Schnee was known affectionately as Addy. He was respected not only for his professional skills, but also for his ability to remain calm when things got tough. He was an exemplary commander, and the crew trusted him with their lives. This trust was crucial because the lives of the submarine crew depended entirely on the captain's judgment. A miscalculation or a single moment of hesitation could lead to the loss of the entire ship. Schnee was part of a generation of commanders who changed the way naval battles were conducted. He believed in aggressive attack tactics, but also understood the value of patience. He was renowned for his ability to locate enemy ships in vast open seas where others might not be able to see anything. His success was not merely luck. It was the result of hours spent observing the horizon and studying the enemy's movement patterns. He knew how to use the darkness of night and the waves to conceal his ship until the perfect moment to strike. Under his leadership, the crew of submarine U-201 became a highly effective operational force. Schnee's composure helped keep the crew focused, even as the enemy's underwater bombs exploded all around them. His accomplishments ultimately earned him some of the highest honors a naval officer could receive. He became one of the most successful submarine captains of the entire war. However, his reputation was built step by step, through long weeks of searching and brief, fierce battles. His skills were about to be tested to the extreme when he took his new vessel out to sea on its first real missions. The commander's experience gave the crew the confidence needed to face the enemy. This leadership was soon put to the test when the vessel embarked on its first long voyage into the treacherous waters of the Atlantic. The first mission of U-201 began in early 1941. The boat spent most of its time in the North Atlantic, the primary area where the German Navy tried to stop supplies from reaching the United Kingdom. During these early missions, U-201 proved to be a highly effective hunter. It often participated in group attacks, where several submarines worked together to surround and overwhelm a key group of merchant ships. By attacking as a group, the submarines could confuse the escort ships and create more chances to fire their torpedoes. One of the most significant periods for the boat occurred in early 1942. During this time, the submarine traveled across the ocean to the eastern coast of the United States. Many ships sailing near the American coast were not yet prepared for submarine attacks, and U-201 found many targets. Working in these distant waters required great skill, as the crew had to manage their fuel and food for a very long journey while remaining hidden from airplanes watching the coast. Throughout its various missions, U-201 was credited with sinking over 20 merchant ships. This total represented a massive amount of lost materials, including food, fuel, and military equipment. However, these successes did not come without a high price. Each mission lasted for weeks or even months, during which the crew was constantly on edge. They had to deal with freezing weather, massive waves that crashed over the deck, and the constant threat of being spotted by enemy planes. As the war moved into 1943, the missions became much more difficult. The Allied forces began using better radar and more airplanes to protect their supply lines. It became harder for U-201 to find targets and even harder to escape after an attack. The escort ships were now equipped with better tools to hear the submarine underwater, and they were much more aggressive in their search. Despite the increasing danger, the boat continued to go back to sea time and time again to carry out its missions. The boat's record of success made it one of the most famous vessels in the fleet. But even the most successful boat and the most experienced crew could not avoid the rising risks of the Atlantic forever. The context sets the stage for its most challenging encounter. Now we follow what actually happened when the boat faced its greatest test during a final high-stakes patrol. In February 1943, U-201 set out on what would be its final journey. The boat was now under the command of Günther Rosenberg, who took over after the previous commander was moved to a different role. By this stage of the war, the North Atlantic had become an incredibly dangerous place for German submarines. The Allied forces had improved their technology and increased the number of planes patrolling the skies. The time when submarines could attack with little fear was over. The mission was to find and attack a specific group of merchant ships, known as Convoy on 166, which was carrying vital supplies across the ocean. The weather during this patrol was terrifying. Huge waves crashed over the deck of the submarine, making it almost impossible for the men on watch to see anything. Despite the freezing cold and the constant motion of the sea, the crew managed to find the group of ships on February the 17th. There were dozens of merchant vessels stretched out across miles of water, surrounded by a protective circle of escort ships. The crew of U-201 prepared for an attack, moving carefully to get within range for their torpedoes. As they approached, the situation changed rapidly. The escort ships were now using a technology called radar, which allowed them to see the submarine on the surface of the water, even through the thick fog and darkness. One of the escort ships, a British vessel named HMS Viscount, spotted a signal on its screen. It immediately turned toward the position of U-201 and increased its speed. Inside the submarine, the crew heard the sound of the enemy ship's engines getting louder. They were no longer the hunters. They were now the targets. Commander Rosenberg ordered an emergency dive. The boat tilted sharply as it rushed beneath the waves to seek safety in the deep. The men inside held their breath, listening to the rhythmic ping of the enemy's underwater detection sonar reflecting off their hull. Above them, the British ship began dropping heavy underwater bombs. These explosions sent massive shock waves through the water, shaking the submarine and causing the lights to flicker. For the next several hours, the crew of U-201 lived through a nightmare of noise and pressure. They had to stay as quiet as possible, moving at very slow speeds to save battery power and avoid making any noise that the enemy could hear. The air inside the boat became thin and stale as they stayed submerged for a long time. Every man was focused on his task, waiting to see if the next explosion would be the one that finally broke the hull. The bombs were set to explode at the specific depth where U-201 was hiding. The shock waves from the explosions were more than the metal hull could take. The violent shaking caused pipes to burst and heavy equipment to break loose from the walls. Water began to spray into the cramped interior under high pressure, making it impossible for the crew to stop the flooding. Within minutes, the submarine lost its ability to stay level in the water. It began to sink rapidly into the much deeper, darker parts of the Atlantic Ocean. The weight of the incoming water was too much for the electric motors to overcome. At a position east of the coast of Newfoundland, the boat finally disappeared from the enemy's sonar screens. There were no survivors. All 45 men on board, including the commander, went down with their ship. It was a sudden and total loss, marking the end of a boat that had once been one of the most successful in the fleet. Today, U-201 remains at the bottom of the ocean, more than 2 miles below the surface. Because of the extreme depth and the remote location, the wreck has never been visited by divers or underwater cameras. It serves as a silent grave for the men who served on it. The ocean floor in that area is cold and still, preserving the remains of the vessel as it was on its final day. The sinking of such a high-achieving submarine was a clear sign that the war at sea had changed forever. The loss of this boat was a major event for the German Navy, but its story did not end with its sinking. Now we look at the lasting impact this submarine and its crew left on the history of naval warfare. U-201 holds a significant place in the history of the war at sea because it experienced both the highest points of success and the total defeat of the German submarine force. During its early years, it was part of a period when these boats seemed almost unstoppable. Its record of sinking many merchant ships showed how vulnerable the supply lines between North America and Europe really were. The boat's career provides a clear picture of how sea combat changed, moving from a time when submarines could operate freely on the surface at night to a time when they were being tracked and destroyed by superior technology. The legacy of the boat is also tied to the man who first led it, Adalbert Schnee. His success with U-201 made him one of the most recognized figures in the submarine service. Because he was so skilled, he was later chosen to help test and develop new types of submarines that were meant to be much faster and stay underwater much longer. While U-201 was an older model that had to spend most of its time on the surface, the lessons learned by its crew helped shape the future of underwater design. This shift from older boats to more advanced machines is a key part of how the war influenced modern ocean travel and engineering. The sinking of such an experienced boat showed that no amount of skill or history could overcome the combined power of radar, airplanes, and better teamwork among the escort ships. It proved that the ocean was no longer a place where a single boat could hide effectively. By studying this boat, we see the exact moment the tide turned.